Welcome to Bankruptcy 101, which is a pre-conference session for the Bankruptcy and Beyond, Organizing for Change in Distressed Cities. Very happy to have 4 distinguished panelists who will be leading us in a very informal discussion about what's taking place in general with issues of municipal finance, and in particular what's taking place in the Detroit bankruptcy and the litigation concerning the emergency manager. I'll introduce people just going from my right over to the left, and they can make their presentations in any order that they want. There was going to be arm wrestling, I think, beforehand about who goes first and who goes second. But Julie Hurwitz is a leading constitutional litigator here in Detroit, principal member of the constitutional litigation firm of Goodwin Hurwitz. And Julie has been part of the team that has been challenging the constitutionality of the emergency manager litigation, and the emergency manager is wrapped up very intimately in the declaration of a financial emergency and the ultimate filing of the municipal bankruptcy. Tom Stevens, to my immediate right, although that's not often a thing that I say, is a graduate of Wayne State University Law School, which we're very proud of, was a member of the Research and Analysis Division of RAD of the City Council, which are the lawyers in support of the City Council before the City Council was restructured and RAD was merged with other issues. So Tom has intimate experience with the implications of emergency manager. He is now one of the leading members of Detroiters Resisting Emergency Manager, DREM. And as I tell people, when I need to know what's going on in the bankruptcy litigation or what's happening and what's the status of any particular event or happening, Tom is the first person that I call, and I really appreciate him coming here. Carol O'Connorclan. O'Claricon. I apologize. I'm going to get that right before tomorrow when I get to introduce you for a second time. So we come up to the adage that practice makes perfect.
It took me years.
Is stepping down from a position as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, is an adjunct professor at the New School, has been experienced with financial catastrophe in municipalities all of her career, going back to the 1970s when New York was struggling with issues of municipal finance, has numerous responsible positions of leadership in municipal finance in Detroit, in the state of New Jersey, an advisory council for the state of New York. Saqib Bhatti is our Nathan's Cumming Fellow. He is the person who is linking the expertise on municipal finance from the national perspective down to the Detroit perspective, has been very intimately involved in some of the work that Demos and others has done to be thinking hard about what is the real nature of Detroit's financial issues, can also be putting the Detroit situation into a broader financial perspective. So I might ask Tom to lead us off, or Saqib, who won the arm wrestle? All right, and thank you very much. And the notion is everybody's going to make very short introductions. They're going to tell you a little bit about their own backgrounds, things that I didn't disclose, talk about the issues that they want to be presenting. But the purpose primarily is to have some informal discussion, some question and answer from members of the audience and the public who want to learn more about what's happening in municipal finance and what are the implications of Detroit bankruptcy. So Tom, thank you very much.
Sir. Hello, thanks for coming. Meet everybody here. My name's Tom Stevens. I'm a graduate of Wayne State University Law School in '86. I've been a people's lawyer here in the city since then. My co-panelist, Julie Hurwitz, gave me my first real job, for which I thank her. And most recently, in terms of this topic, between 2008 and 2013, worked for the City Council Research and Analysis Division, during which time the city's fiscal crisis and the state's emergency management policy became these two trains that have been running on the same line and have now run into each other. I've been asked, I think, to set the stage with this is by a very brief summary of the status of the bankruptcy, and I will be very brief, because the problem is that if one was to try to describe everything that's going on in the bankruptcy, we would be here for hours. Because we're here at a very crucial time in it. There are many, many proceedings going on and many, many issues. Principally, by the middle of this month, the Jones Day law firm, in its guise as the City of Detroit, is required to send out what they call the solicitation packages to all the individual creditors, the pensioners, the bondholders, the bond insurers, and so forth, when they figure out who is the responsible party for various bonds, which they're still working on. And then by the end of June, everybody's supposed to vote on that, and there's supposed to be either a yay or nay. in the plan of adjustment that they've put forward. It is widely expected that they will not get a full vote on that unless the Chief Judge Rosen of the U.S. District Court in Detroit can broker some kind of a global settlement. And there's going to be a lot of frantic activity around that between now and then. Even before, as I said, the solicitation package goes out in mid-April, but even before then, on Wednesday, the judge will receive resumes from experts, independent experts that he solicited. These people are going to have an enormous amount of power. That's going to be a big development. We just found out about that on March 24th. On Friday, he's going at 10 o'clock, Friday, April 11th, he's going to announce his decision in the third attempted settlement that Jones Day has tried to negotiate, Jones Day and Pepper Hamilton, I should say, have tried to negotiate with Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and UBS on these municipal weapons of mass destruction, the interest rate swaps that they've been trying to settle. And that's going to be a very interesting development. There was a full-day trial on it last Thursday. The plan is to try to get that settlement approved by the judge and then use those banks as an impaired creditor to vote in favor of the plan and cram it down on everybody else. So these next couple of days this week, Wednesday on the experts and Friday on the swaps trial, are going to be, I think, early indicators of to what extent the credibility of Jones Day, Kevin Orr, and Governor Snyder's version of restructuring is playing out with the judge. In addition to that, if you read your Free Press yesterday, you know that they're now full steam ahead on what will be, if they completed, the largest privatization of a water and sewer system in North America, which they're trying to do on the cheap and on the quick and dirty, which is one of the more outrageous things they're doing out of many outrageous things. And so that's going to be unfolding in the next few weeks and months. Is let's make a deal with our water and sewer system that serves almost 40% of Michiganders in the heart of the Great Lakes. As that all plays out, and I'm getting to the end of this initial presentation, as we get into June, we're going to see major motions on the plan of adjustment and the procedures for voting on the plan of adjustment and whether there's impaired creditors that can cram it down on people and so forth. And after July 2nd, the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in mid-July, we're going to see a trial on the plan of adjustment. And it's going to be a media circus and a political and legal hoopla. Benchmark, barn burner. That's basically what we're looking at. Meanwhile, you'll be hearing from Julie. There's a constitutional litigation going forward challenging the emergency management statute. There's an appeal in the Sixth Circuit. There's a couple different appeals in the Sixth Circuit. One specifically of Rhodes' opinion as to eligibility and his decision that public pensions that are state guaranteed could be impaired in bankruptcy, as well as another one that was heard on bank a couple weeks ago by the Pontiac retirees that challenges the constitutionality of emergency management. I could go on and on, as I said, but those are the basic outlines with a crayon, of what the status of the bankruptcy is. And so I will turn it over to my friend Saket.
Hey everyone, I'm Saket Bhatti. I'm a fellow at the Nathan Cummings Foundation, where I'm doing work around the role that municipal finance deals play in public budget crises everywhere, especially in the city of Detroit. So I was asked to speak about the financial state of the city, where things are at. So in doing that, I'm going to draw actually largely on this report that Demos put out last fall that really looked, sort of the definitive report that looked at the Detroit bankruptcy and what's actually going on here. And so basically, when I think about this, I think there's 5 main points. The first, and perhaps the most important, is that Detroit did not just go bankrupt. The bankruptcy was a political decision. It was made by Governor Rick Snyder, the Republican legislature, and a series of Wall Street banks. Detroit was really pushed into bankruptcy. The bankruptcy was not inevitable, even until, even now there's actually a question as to whether or not Detroit should even be considered bankrupt. The bankruptcy did not just happen. It was a calculated, orchestrated decision. Bankruptcy was done to Detroit. It didn't just happen. The second key thing, and this is important to realize, is that there's really 2 reasons why Detroit is bankrupt. The first is a sharp decline in revenue, and the second is the rising cost of bad Wall Street deals. So the decline in revenue, basically, it was, largely it was, caused by decades of depopulation and deindustrialization, but that was really exacerbated by the foreclosure crisis and the economic crash, which really caused, tax revenues take a huge dive because you saw property values decimated and unemployment. Because of unemployment, you saw income tax revenues also go down. But really, what it's dealt sort of was the nail in the coffin of the Detroit bankruptcy was that all of this was really made untenable by the legislature's decision in 2010 to drastically slash revenue sharing with the city of Detroit. So Detroit, there's state taxes are shared between all the state taxes are all paid to the state, which then parcels them out to different parts of the different cities within the state. So that the state revenue sharing went down drastically. I think the overall number was something along the lines of $62 or $65 million in 2010. Part of that was because of the decline in the state's population, or in the city's population relative to the suburbs and the rest of the state. But actually, and so that part was constitutionally mandated. But a much larger portion, I believe about 2/3 of that decline, was actually discretionary made by the legislature. And that actually played a huge role in causing the Detroit's revenues to decrease. In fact, over the last 5 years, revenues have gone down 20%. All of this was made even worse by the banks that swooped in to take advantage of a city in distress. Just like the banks, targeted cash-strapped homeowners with predatory loans that have high costs and hidden risks, they've done the same with Detroit over the years and extracted hundreds of millions of dollars from the city, especially through deals, through this complex financing scheme from 2005 that included the interest rate swaps that Tom mentioned. The third big point is that spending is actually not the problem. Detroit has cut overall spending drastically by about 40% since 2008. Operating expenses are down. This was largely done by laying off 2,300 workers. The fact is that the city actually cannot cut its way to recovery because there's nothing left to cut. The fourth major point to bear in mind about Detroit is that the emergency managers put out this number that the city has $18 billion in debt. That number is misleading, inflated, and frankly irrelevant. The fact is that it's misleading and inflated because it includes all sorts of things that are not actually debt of the city. So for instance, Tom mentioned the water and sewage department. Well, the water and sewage department services 40% of the population of Michigan. It's all of southeastern Michigan, of which Detroit is maybe, I think about a quarter of that is actually serves the city of Detroit. It has $6 billion in debt. Well, all $6 billion of that is included as part of the $18 billion. The water and sewage department is not a part of the city. It is not. It is actually a legally and financially separate entity from the city. The city actually administers its budget is housed within the city, but it's actually just a pass-through. It's actually not a part of the city's debt. And there's a couple other examples of that too, where the number has been hugely inflated. But the other piece that's important to recognize is that actually the amount of the city's debt is largely irrelevant to the issue of municipal bankruptcy, because municipal bankruptcies are not about your overall debt load. They're about unlike a corporate bankruptcy, a municipal bankruptcy is defined as your ability to pay your debt as the bills come due. And so, the city, say I have a $200,000 mortgage on a house, if I don't have $200,000 in my bank account, it doesn't mean I'm broke, because I'm not expected to pay that all off right now. And so to say that if you don't have $18 billion, you're broke, doesn't make any sense, because you're actually not paying off all of that debt right now. You're paying off the debt over a course of 20 to 30 years. And so municipal bankruptcy is just not, it's not about your overall debt load, it's about your cash flow. And so that brings us to the final point, the last one, which is that to actually get Detroit out of bankruptcy, what you really need to address is its cash flow shortage, its deficit, which according to the emergency manager's own numbers is $198 million, not $18 billion, right? It's $198 million, that's the deficit according to the bankruptcy filing that the city has. And so the key thing is figuring out how do you actually raise $198 million, which seems a lot more doable than $18 billion. The $18 billion is a scare tactic. The other thing that's important with this is that it's that the $198 million does not include, for instance, any potential payouts on the interest rate swaps, again, that Tom referenced, where the city emergency manager or is trying to strike a deal to pay out banks at this point $85 million related to the interest rate swaps. That is not included in the $198 million. So the key thing is you need to figure out how to raise $198 million, and you need to figure out how to not pay the $85 million that is not factored in there, and for which there's a strong legal ground not to pay that. And then in the longer term, we need to put into place structural programs that will actually allow the city to regrow its tax base over time. Thank you.
Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Julie Hurwitz, and I am a civil rights attorney. I've been practicing law in the city of Detroit since 1982 after graduating from the University of Michigan Law School. I was, for 10 years, the executive director of the Maurice and Jane Sugar Law Center for Economic and Social Justice as well. Currently, I specialize in litigating governmental and corporate misconduct, with a primary emphasis on police misconduct. I'm also now a member of the legal team challenging the constitutionality of the Michigan Emergency Manager Act, or as we like to refer to it as the Michigan Dictator Law. This is a conference about the Detroit bankruptcy. Why are we talking about what's going on with the challenge to the emergency manager law? As Saqib, I think, referred to, the bankruptcy didn't just happen. It was a well-planned and well-oiled plan that had been in the works since the Snyder administration was elected at the end of 2010. And it is really the genesis of the current configuration and power relationships that are currently surrounding the bankruptcy that we're experiencing here in Detroit. Back in 2010, the Snyder administration first railroaded the passage of an earlier version of the current emergency manager law, Public Act 4. And at that time, I was part of a legal team working with the Sugar Law Center and the National Lawyers Guild and AFSCME and several other labor lawyers to wage a constitutional challenge to that earlier version of the law. While that case was pending, the people in the state of Michigan rallied and gathered over 200,000 signatures to repeal the law as part of a public referendum. So we became involved in the challenge to keep that initiative on the ballot when the Snyder forces challenged the validity of the petitions, you may recall, because the point size on the title of the signature petitions was not, according to them, the strict 14-point type font size that they're supposed to be. Well, after wasting a tremendous amount of time and resources, all the way up to the Michigan Supreme Court, we prevailed. The initiative went on the ballot. The Public Act 4 was overwhelmingly repealed by a large majority of voters in the state. And within a month, the Snyder administration railroaded the passage of what we are now confronted with that has Kevin Orr in power, and that is now Public Act 436. We immediately filed another constitutional challenge to that law under several theories that I will very quickly try to summarize for you and give you some overview of how this case ties in with what's going on in the city and the bankruptcy that is eating us alive. The current challenge was filed in federal court in March of 2013. We were moving along between March and July, getting ready to have the judge make a substantive ruling on the underlying theories that we were alleging, which are a violation of the First Amendment right to redress and petition the government, the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, which has two prongs to it. One, a racially based discrimination in the way in which the decision to appoint emergency managers in communities all over the state just so happened to have hit the poorest and most highly concentrated populations of African American citizens in the state, and on the basis, equal protection on the basis of wealth. Because at the same time, as I said, it's hitting the poorest communities and the poorest people. And what this law does ultimately is it takes away our right to vote. It is a fundamentally anti-democratic law, and it gives supreme unilateral power to the governor and the executive branch to appoint an all-powerful emergency manager, such as Kevin Orr, to make decisions across the board that have nothing to do with the particular financial issues that are confronting the community, but he is, as are all the emergency managers now in the state, basically, they run everything. They have the power to invalidate contracts, they have the power to suspend city charters, they have the power to remove elected officials from office, they have the power to invalidate laws that were legislatively enacted democratically. They have all complete unilateral authority. They speak and are accountable to no one but the governor and the treasurer of the state of Michigan. We have a 13th Amendment claim, which is not too frequently litigated part of our Constitution. It is the part of the Constitution that prohibits slavery. And there is some support for the theory that by disenfranchising specific groups of people, such as African Americans in the state of Michigan, that reintroduces vestiges of slavery. If you do not have the right to vote, then you are no better than a slave in this country. And we also have a claim under the Voting Rights Act. Within 3 months of the filing of our lawsuit, July 18th, the petition for bankruptcy was filed. By July 25th, an order was entered by the bankruptcy court that swooped our case in, even though we don't even name any city of Detroit defendants, and we're not making any allegations specifically as to the city of Detroit. We were swooped in under the all-encompassing stay order of the bankruptcy court. So our case was stayed, and we couldn't do anything. Finally, by November of 2013, we were able to convince Judge Rhodes that this case had no place being stymied in this way, and he agreed with us, and he entered an order lifting the stay. Since November of 2013 until Friday, there were, I tried to make a little chart of what's been going on with this lawsuit since we filed it last year, and I got myself so confused that I just gave up on it because it's so convoluted. They have attempted to file motions for reconsideration, motions to reinstitute the stay. They filed a notice of appeal. This all has to do with whether or not we and you, as citizens of the state of Michigan, have the right to have the constitutionality of this law adjudicated by a federal court. And their argument is, for all intents and purposes, it boils down to this. They're arguing, and they're arguing vigorously. The state of Michigan has filed an appeal. The city has filed an appeal. And their argument is, we can't let this law's constitutionality be determined because, oh my God, what if it really is unconstitutional? It will screw up Kevin Orr's power, and we can't let that happen. It will do unbelievable damage to the current bankruptcy because it will interfere with the all-encompassing power of Kevin Orr. So we can't let the constitutionality of this law be tested, challenged, or ruled on by a judge. So there are now 2 appeals pending in front of Judge Bernie Friedman that he's been assigned by the bankruptcy court to be the intermediate appellate judge. And on Friday, he issued an order basically saying, and we think this is what it says, I am holding the appeals, I'm staying the appeals, which was finally the green light that we've needed to get rid of all the time and energy we've been spending just fighting over whether we should be allowed to have this issue tested. And we are now pretty cleanly in front of Judge George Stee, and we have a hearing scheduled on April 30th where he is going to hear arguments about the fundamental questions that we've been trying to get in front of him now for over a year, and that is there a valid basis on which to challenge the constitutionality of the emergency manager law in the state of Michigan? So that's where we now stand, and we are preparing to go forward with that, and we are confident that we will win this motion and be able to really do the discovery that we need to do and bring our own motion to have a ruling, finally, once and for all, on whether or not this law is constitutional. So that's where things stand, and I will sit down and answer any questions you have when it's time. Thank you.
My name is Carol O'Claricon, and I now live in New York City. And in the interim between leaving Ann Arbor and arriving in New York City, I don't know, since arriving in New York City, rather, I have been the finance commissioner and the budget director of New York City, which is a pretty huge place, about the fourth largest government in America, and the deputy treasurer of New Jersey. But I am not a lawyer. And so I stand here pretty much intimidated by the surroundings of this beautiful moot court sort of atmosphere. And I'm afraid that anything I say it sort of classifies as practicing without a license. I'm an economist by training. And as you can tell from what I said about what I've done, I'm a fiscal person. I'm a money person. And so I have a couple of reactions, I guess. I will not pass myself off as any kind of expert on Detroit's situation. But I am giving a talk tomorrow morning, which I hope you will attend. And what they've asked me to do was put municipal distress in a wider national framework, and I try to do that tomorrow. But from what I have seen in my experience, there are an awful lot of places that are in fiscal stress. Fiscal stress often leads to further distress and quite often leads to fiscal crisis. It has only rarely led to bankruptcy. Detroit is, in that sense, like a lot of other places, but unique in having a Chapter 9 filing for bankruptcy. And so somebody like me kind of wants to ask, why? Why did that happen here and not in other places? Well, I have close experience of two places that certainly had fiscal crises, New York City and the District of Columbia. When I was at Brookings, I did a book on the District of Columbia, and I also became a consultant as a result of that with the control board that the federal government empowered to run the District of Columbia. And so I ask, what was the difference between those two places and Detroit? And you may or may not agree, and that's why we have more than one person speaking here, and that's what you're all welcome to do. But to me, bankruptcy is both a last resort, very much a last resort, and very much a kind of failure. And here's what I mean by the failure. To reach to Chapter 9 bankruptcy, it seems to me, you've definitely reached an impasse. Somebody isn't talking to somebody else, or your creditors, or your government and your creditors, and the superior level of government, the state, or in the case of the District of Columbia, the federal government, if it had sent DC into bankruptcy, would have had to say, we don't want to talk about this anymore. We're going to let a bankruptcy court deal with it. My experience, I quite agree with Shakib that Municipal bankruptcy is generally about illiquidity, right? It is about the inability to pay your bills. But in New York and in the District of Columbia, they couldn't pay their bills. And if you can't pay your bills, you generally work out a situation where you try to find a way to do it. That is, you try to find somebody who will help you, who will lend you something. If no one will lend you anything, you look to the people who are working for you or to whom you would generally pay money, and you try to say, I don't have this much money to pay you now. Can we pay you less? Will you agree to work for less? Blah, blah, blah. In both of those places, that worked to some degree. It clearly didn't happen here. And I also agree that fixing your liquidity problem, which didn't manage to happen here, is only half of the battle. The other part is putting in place a longer-run solution to stabilize your revenues and your expenses so that over time they match. I do not believe that Detroit's only problem reduces itself to $168 million cash flow issue. It's got much bigger problems than that, much bigger. Its revenues do not match its outgoing, and they haven't for a long time. And it's played a lot of, I can say it not having looked at Detroit at all, because it happened in New York, it happened in Washington, it happened in Philadelphia, it happened in a whole number of other places where that's exactly the situation, where you're spending much more than you're bringing in, and you're disguising it by short-run borrowing, by paying for this year with next year's revenue, by bringing everything forward. It's a whole bunch of gimmicks, and I'm sure they've been used here. I'm sure they've been used here, and that means you have to come up with a long-term plan. You have to figure out what your structural imbalance is, and you got to set in place a long-term plan to do that. Now, in New York City and in the District of Columbia, the superior, and I use that word probably with quotes around it, the higher, let's call it, the higher level of government, the parent government, said, we're going to make this work. And they imposed a control board. That's what New York State did on New York City, and a financing mechanism. They established in New York, they established the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which loaned money to the city of New York. It issued debt. It issued debt not supported by the state of New York, but they intercepted money that was being collected by the state, sales tax money that was being collected by the state on behalf of New York City, and they said, we're going to call this a new kind of debt. It no longer has New York City's name on it. It has the full faith and credit of the state of New York. It's the New York State Municipal Assistance Corporation, but it's your money, New York City. And there were a lot of people who said you didn't have a right to do that, and that got litigated too. But it did have, the state of New York did have a right to do that, because the state of New York, in effect, founded the city of New York. The state of New York has the sovereignty and the ability to run things in the city of New York. And I dare say, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think this is exactly what you're up against in Michigan, right? Michigan has the sovereignty. Detroit doesn't have that sovereignty. And when it came to the District of Columbia, which had exactly the same kind of issue, couldn't pay its bills, the federal government came in, put in a control board, and the federal government issued debt on behalf of the District of Columbia. And then it said, you've got 5 years to set up a budget that's in structural balance. And that's what the state of New York had said to the city of New York. They patterned it, the District of Rescue, an awful lot on the New York City Rescue. And they were in there working on it every day. And what I worry about in Detroit I'm going to say it really clearly, what I worry about in Detroit is that somebody's going to declare victory after bankruptcy and walk away and not do any more, because that's not going to solve the problem. You got much bigger problems than that. And you have to be in it in the long game. Somebody has to put together a long-term structural plan, and then they have to watch and make sure that it's being followed, and that it's being followed quarter by quarter. In New York City, we still to this day issue quarterly revisions to our financial plan and budget. We show what is happening according to generally accepted accounting principles, not fly-by-night cash budgeting, but really strict budgeting, because the law says we must. And that's all public. When those are issued, they're available to the public, they're on the website, and we still have 3. This happened in 1975. This is how many years? I can't even calculate. More than 30 years? 39, almost 40 years. We're still doing this. We got 3 oversight agencies still looking at this: the state controller, the city controller, and an independent budget office, and a state financial control board that still issues reviews. It has no power except to bring transparency. So that's my message to you. This is this problem took a long time to develop. Don't think of bankruptcy as a magic bullet. You've got a long way back. And what's important is if you have help doing it. And nobody declared him insolvent. That's what that's what they avoided. But by not going to bankruptcy court, that's what they avoided. Instead, in the case of New York City, they had, I think it was $2.5 billion, it might have been closer to $3 billion, of short-term debt that they kept rolling over. The banks kept rolling over this debt, and then the banks said, we're not going to do it anymore. And this was what was meeting the payroll. This is what was paying their bills, right? It was called short-term debt, but it was done all the time. So it was repeating short-term debt. It might as well been long-term bonds, but it wasn't. And so when the bank said, sorry, we're not doing this anymore, the city's controller said to the state, I'm not going to be able to meet payroll on next Friday or 2 Fridays from now when I have to meet payroll. If I don't get anything from these banks, I'm not going to have it. And they called in, and so the governor called in people and all the unions, and they all sat there, and they all took a deferral. They all took but they all did it together in a structure, and that structure was pulled together by the state.
Let me just, we're going to take some more questions in a minute, but I want to continue that dialogue a little bit. I mean, we are seeing here that this is a really complicated situation. There's short term, there's medium term, there's long term, there's legalities, there's debt, there's political dynamics between the state and the local, there's constitutional as well as bankruptcy legal issues, and there's also different timeframes. This is not in the 1970s anymore. And although I totally agree with Carol that this is a long-term thing, and I also totally agree with her that in the fiscal frame and in terms of accounting and in terms of debt, there are enormous similarities between Detroit and New York. There are other levels here that are not the same. And I would point out that the argument that because Congress could impose this on the district, the state should be able to impose it on Detroit is not the way I would cut the argument. I would say that that injustice does not justify this injustice, and I think that the breakdown of the political process is a huge problem here. I wanted to, in order to extend the discussion in the various realms here, I have with me "Racing to Justice" by John Powell, who's one of our Detroiters, who's one of our speakers here, and I think there's a short part in here that describes Detroit's situation very well and how it just differs from New York's. And with your permission, I'd like to briefly go into, what we're dealing with here. John is speaking at the end of the day tomorrow, as people know. He says, segregation's racialization of space races individuals by defining blackness as inner city, unemployed and uneducated and criminal, and whiteness as suburban, employed, educated, and law-abiding. When low-income communities of color are spatially segregated with little access to opportunities such as sustainable jobs, high-performing schools, and quality health care and child care, they are deprived of the resources critical to quality of life, financial stability, and social advancement. Isolation and disinvestment threaten individuals and their families, but they also affect entire communities. Eliminating these patterns of isolation would result in wider distribution of opportunity across metro areas and more flexibility for all in terms of cultural and residential choices. Another driver of needed change may be pressing environmental concerns and the need for more sustainable development practices in our intensely segregated and stratified society. Acceleration of the current modest movements toward urban infill and public transportation could be increased and targeted to reduce our environmental impact and improve access to opportunity. At the end of the quote, Detroit doesn't have the New York subway. It doesn't have Wall Street. The political dynamic, the racial dynamic, the differences between the environmental issues that we're running up against here in the 21st century compared to the 70s, these are all at play here, and they all affect the sort of brutality of the emergency manager law versus what New York State did. Other questions? Lee?
Yeah, I was just curious about the discussion around the state being kind of the parent of the city. And my understanding from reading the article by Robert Klein, which was the former treasurer for the state of Michigan, he outlined very clearly in the New York Times how the state intentionally withheld revenue from the city to force the city into emergency management. And to me, it seems disingenuous to talk about all things being equal when the state is intentionally working against its child, the city, and forcing it into financial distress so that it can impose an emergency manager and take away the voting rights of the minority population in the state of Michigan. So to me, I think that the federal government has an obligation to step in at that point because, as you said, the city exists at the request of the state, and the state is intentionally forcing it into financial distress that's outlined in numerous cases.
Yeah, I'm not trying to make a value judgment. I'm really not. Just because it happens doesn't make it right. I quite agree with you. There are bad parents as well as good parents.
You're right, yeah.
Right? And you have to live with what you have. So to me, this is not an issue of value judgments. This is the reality, where the sovereignty is and where it isn't. There were plenty of actions that New Yorkers looked at that New York State had imposed on New York City. For example, in the state of New York, like in no other state in the nation, the state and the federal government share Medicaid, which is a major poverty program or health program for low-income people. Everywhere, almost everywhere else in the country, the state pays its share. Whatever, if the feds say we do a 50-50 split, it's a 50-50 split. In poor places like Mississippi, where they say, oh, you're poor, the feds pay 70% and Mississippi pays 30%, whatever. In New York, with the feds, it's 50-50. The state of New York passed 50% of that itself down to the city of New York. That was a burden unlike any burden for any other city. Did people in New York City object to that? You betcha. Did they complain the state's not being fair to us? Yes. And what did the state do? Well, that's the way it is. This is what we do. We have a legislature, and the legislature isn't going to change it. And they haven't. It's taken, again, close to this 40 years to get to the point where the state is beginning to take that burden away from the city. And it isn't just because of New York City, it's because the counties that it was imposing on it too have begun to complain, and the property taxes that have had to be raised in order for these local governments to pay for their share of Medicaid, which isn't paid by any local government anywhere else in the country, is finally causing them to scream. So I'm not saying it isn't an injustice, I'm just saying it's the way it is.
So that begs my next question is, well, there's no economic remedy because the state collects the money and gives it to the city. So
Worse.
what legal recourse does the city have
Exactly.
to take against an abusive parent?
Respond to his first question
Yeah.
before we get to that one?
Yeah.
I think, I was going to say abusive parent. I think economically, fiscally, the state has been an abusive parent. And even the feds, too. I mean, Detroit's share, even if you compare New York, as I said. Legally, though, it is important to recognize that there's a couple different parts about that. It is that the state is legally the city's constitutional parent and has a great deal of power. The question of whether the state has overstepped even that power in the emergency management law, which has no precedent anywhere else, is the issue in Julie's case. And it's an important issue, and it is still an open issue. In fact, at the Sixth Circuit en banc hearing of the Pontiac retirees case, March 19th, just recently, one of the more conservative judges in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals asked the state attorney general representative, point blank, where do you have any precedent for this power of this? He called it an extreme and a radical power. So you've got the political and the economically abusive parent with the legal right to do this, and then you've got all of the additional stuff that goes into Detroit's, as I agree with Carol, long-term problems that it has to deal with. And then the other point is about the bankruptcy is it's not us that's treating the bankruptcy like the magic bullet. I mean, that's really maybe the Achilles heel of Governor Snyder and Kevin Orr, is that they have been saying this from day one, is that Kevin Orr is going to make the buses run on time. Kevin Orr is going to put cops on the street. Kevin Orr is going to put out the fires and bring the ambulances. As it becomes clear that this is what it is, which is this neoliberal swoop down and get control over this border city and its assets and its people, and use it for the way that Rahm Emanuel, if you read the papers recently, is using TIFs in Chicago to hand out goodies to his political supporters. As that becomes apparent, this is going to be more difficult.
I have my own theory about precisely that question, and it's not really a legal theory, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. It's really a historical and political theory, and it goes back to why the city of Detroit is in such, while there are certainly lessons to be learned from the past and from what other cities have experienced, Detroit is so unique, and it presents, on the one hand, an unbelievable opportunity for some forces who have ulterior motives to use Detroit as an experiment of sorts. And it really goes back to the history of the role that the auto industry has played in the formation of the infrastructure that's been essentially abandoned since the early 70s, on the heels of the rebellion and on the heels of white flight and on the heels of capital flight. And this is a city that was created for the needs and for the profit maximizing goals of the auto industry going back to the 30s, where it was designed as a hub, it was designed to be sprawl, it was designed not to have public transportation, it was designed for single-family homes to stretch out as far as the eyes could see, and everybody has a car or two cars, and everybody's got so on and on and on. And here we are now left with what they left behind, with a predominantly impoverished population with no economic base, and we're told, fix it. Oh, you can't fix it. So now here's an opportunity to come in and try something new. And what I see happening is not, I think what we're going to inevitably be left with, if this emergency manager law is left intact, is an unilateral power by one individual to privatize everything. And we will be left with Detroit Inc. And that's what I see happening down the road. That's my theory about how that interplays with what makes Detroit a unique, historical, and extremely critical situation and for the federal government to pay. I do think this is a national emergency.
I mean, I think, related to that, I think, the fact is that there is money, right? That's the thing. Like, I was talking to Les Leopold, who's written a lot of books about the economy, and he sort of says his, obsession these days is answering the question, in the richest country in the world, why do we all think we're broke? And the fact is there is money. There is money in the state of Michigan. Michigan actually is, I believe, #1 in terms of corporate tax subsidies of any state in the country, right? Many of those corporate tax subsidies are in the city of Detroit, right? The fact is there's so many subsidies here that are going to, encourage the building of the hockey stadium, or to encourage Quicken Loans to, $200 million to move their headquarters from the suburbs into the city. So now, but instead of building jobs in the city, all that does is have commuters that are commuting into the city from the suburbs, right? The fact is that there is money, and the state actually has responsibility to the city of Detroit. The fact is that if the state has sort of been complicit in sort of pushing the city over the edge, and what you've seen happen here really is that you've had the city hollowed out and all the wealth moved to the suburbs. I mean, the fact is that the Detroit region is actually still quite wealthy, right? I believe someone was telling me that the number of billionaires in Metro Detroit is actually one of the highest in the country. Like Houston, which has it's the fourth biggest city in the country, just last year overtook Detroit, the Detroit metro area, for a number of billionaires. The fact is there's a lot of money here, and the question at the end of the day is whether or not the state's actually willing to raise taxes where it needs to, actually, on corporations that aren't paying their fair share. And that's not just the question here in Detroit or here in Michigan, but that's the question across the country, because the fact is that this whole issue of states passing on their financial distress to cities, that's actually happening everywhere. Detroit's the most extreme example, and it's also even more extreme because here it wasn't just a matter of passing on financial distress, but there are political motivations for trying to disenfranchise people of Detroit. But this broader question is something that is true everywhere, and the simple answer is we need to raise taxes on the top, the top 2%, and we need to raise tax on corporations.
Yeah, you don't think there can be enough pressure from the rest of this region, that is from Oakland County and from other parts of Wayne County and from around Washtenaw, whatever. Oh, I understand. I understand why people moved there, right? I understand that only too well. I spent a year in New Jersey government, so let me tell you, that's like Michigan writ large, or like Detroit writ large. You want to look at Camden or Newark? Yeah. But what I'm hearing is there's no leadership out of the state capitol.
Or regionally.
Or regionally.
Well, like I was trying to explain earlier, we are viewing the litigation strategy is a very small part of the overall what's needed to fight against what's going on. And we're up against an extremely conservative to reactionary court, maybe not with this particular judge, but as it makes its way up the appellate system to the Sixth Circuit and then to the Supreme Court, we are not that, we're preparing ourselves for the worst. So we're taking it one step at a time. So the first step we are involved in is let's get this law declared unconstitutional. And once that happens, it will open the door for all kinds of other legal challenges that would be based on a determination that this is an unconstitutional law. So all the stuff that's been going on in Benton Harbor and Ecorse and Allen Park, Pontiac, Flint, and Detroit, anything that was done by an unconstitutionally appointed emergency manager is subject to being challenged. And so we fully expect that that's what's going to happen. I can't answer your question, though, about how it's going to happen and when it's going to happen, but that's what we are hoping to position ourselves to be able to do.
Right now, Detroit is not included in that case. As a condition of lifting the stay Any claims against Kevin Orr around Detroit were taken out for now. Now,
Which is why the NAACP's case lost their efforts to lift the stay, because they were focused almost exclusively on what's going on in the city of Detroit.
I think that we can all see that if there is a decision by a judge that some aspect of Public Act 436 is unconstitutional in one or more of the ways that are alleged in the case that's going forward, and it's being done in Detroit, there's going to be a legal issue there. We can't tell you what the result's going to be. I think the bigger issue, frankly, is that it's not going to be decided legally.
I'd say the key thing with that is, you know, I've been saying, a number of us have been saying that Detroit was pushed into bankruptcy for political reasons by the governor, by the legislature, by various other folks. The question is, why did they do it? Who pushed them to do it, right? The fact is they're carrying water for a number of people. They're carrying water for Dan Gilbert, the Illiches, the Carmanos, the various folks who are profiting off of this. And so the fact is that when we're thinking about what is the organizing needs to happen, it's, you know, what you don't need to convince the people in Oakland County who are afraid of coming to Detroit. The fact is what you need to do is create a crisis for the people who are profiting off of this, who actually want this to happen. This is happening because someone wants it to happen, because someone's benefiting off of it. And we need to identify who those people are and bring the crisis to their doorstep. So for instance, if, you know, is Illich the one who has the hockey stadium? It is, right? Right? If like the hundreds of millions of dollars subsidies suddenly disappeared, he would actually care, right? So the thing is, like, how do you actually identify the interests of the people who are actually profiting off of this and put those interests into jeopardy to actually force change? And so that's why, I mean, to me, it's not as simple, because the fact is, it's not just as simple as convincing the folks in Lansing. The fact is, if it was convincing the folks in Lansing, then when PA4 was repealed by every single county in the state, they wouldn't have dared pass it again. They passed it again anyway under PA 436 because they're still, you know, they're doing the bidding of these other folks who are actually profiting off the system, and they're counting on their corporate cash, which is, you know, after Citizens United and the McCutcheon decision from last week, it's, you know, even more of a factor. Money in politics is huge. And so the fact is, we need to figure out how we're actually creating a crisis for the folks who are profiting off of this, and our organizing should be directed at those people to actually force change.
Can I ask a question? Because from my experience and from the work I do, I don't know if it's 436 that's a good idea, but states, there are a lot of states in this country that have there's a lot of municipal distress. Let's start from that. All right? So then the question is, isn't it better to have the state paying some attention to what's going on and what's happening to its local governments? And isn't it better if they can do something to help before the worst possible happens? All right, so that, to me, that's, okay, so that's intellectual question number one. I think most people would say, yeah, that's preferable, right? Not that many states even do that, right? North Carolina, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania each had lots of bankrupt localities in the 30s, in the 20s and in the 30s, which was another boom-bust, right, cycle in American history. And their response was to form like local government oversight components in the state government, and to start paying some attention to what was going on in their local governments. New York doesn't have anything like that. California doesn't have anything like that. Texas doesn't have anything like that, right? So the question, it seems to me, for Michigan is, you're trying to do something here, right? You passed, what, one law that people didn't like, and then you passed another law. I don't think it's the emergency law that's the issue. It's the issue of, shouldn't it be in everybody's interest to have the state paying attention to fiscal distress in its cities and counties? Do we have a problem? We have a problem with that?
Wait. Let me
Carol,
just,
We'll get to you.
let me just lay out a little bit of factual clarity here.
Okay, thank you.
And the fact is that the state of Michigan has always had some type
that's
of
right.
emergency financial
That's correct. Right.
legislation.
I remember that.
And what we're dealing with here is it's crossed the line between a legitimate interest that the state has to take care of its children and invest in its children and bring and nurture its children to we're locking you in a closet and chaining you to the bedpost and
what it
bring you
was
a
it-
cup of water every few days.
And what was it that failed in the way that the state had been doing it previously?
The state wasn't, I mean, the political agenda has shifted so dramatically since the Snyder administration. Well, really, it goes back to the Engler administration to some degree, but the political landscape has shifted, and, it's the power of capital that has merged so closely with the public sector and the agenda of the corporate lobby that has seen a perfect opportunity for itself to use Detroit as a testing ground, I think.
The question is excellent, and in addition to what Julie said, the Wall Street crash of 2008, the unique circumstances of Detroit with regard to not only that event, but the previous problems of the housing bubble and also the predatory
Lending.
subprime lending issues. You've got Detroit, unlike New York, unlike even I think you're right. Camden and other towns in New Jersey are sort of like, but Detroit being the one big place with the rest of the state united against it leads to a certain dynamic. And so you have, yes, in theory, you do want the state to quote unquote pay attention to it, but when you have this disparity in social power and the racial dynamic of it and the unique circumstances of Detroit with regard to the state, you have a very bad result. I think that's what people are trying to say, and I'll let them speak for themselves too. We got one who hasn't spoken yet. Can I jump in? I mean, that's absolutely right. And the other part of that we noticed right away when the very first version of what became Public Act 4 was first introduced in February of 2011 is that you don't have to have an emergency manager in Michigan to be emergency managed. With this law on the books, it rigidly enacts a neoliberal funding and policy structure, and if you don't follow it, you will have an emergency manager. And anyway, you have to do that anyway. And that's why you kept hearing city council members under Public Act 4 saying, you have to think like an emergency manager. So we have always had in Michigan laws like the Glenn-Style Revenue Act and the Municipal Finance Act that require balanced budgets, of course. Public Act 4 came in, and now Public Act 436 and said, well, and if you don't, this is going to be the consequence, and there's no precedent anywhere for this consequence, and it eviscerates any local sense of control, which has horribly destructive effects in the name of this conference beyond bankruptcy. As to both the Detroit public schools, which John Telford asked me to mention in this conference, and the water system, in terms of emergency management, what we had was something where the underlying policy of having in the water system protecting the Great Lakes, it was originally an EPA thing, and in the Detroit public schools, education got mixed up through this emergency management bastardization of politics and law with money. And so when the old emergency financial manager law ran into problems in Michigan was when Robert Bobb, appointed by a Democrat, tried to extend his emergency financial manager authority to, as in his words, everything that touches a nickel. And it was the court's rejection of that sweeping authority that preceded the Snyder Republican legislature's initiation of this new unconstitutional extreme authority. And in the water department, although it was originally an environmental issue, it became much more so, understandably, the regional cost sharing for meeting all the needs. So what you have is a dispute about money, a dispute about educating our children, a dispute about clean water and so forth that is being managed by these authoritarian steps where there is no pretense of fairness. That's the problem, I think.
I mean, Detroit in some cases sort of a testing ground, right? Sort of a laboratory. The fact is that the piece of legislation, in a PA4 and the PA436 emergency manager law, it's a piece of model legislation that was developed by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which has also developed standard ground laws, various other right-wing reactionary legislation. And they've also passed it in a number of other states after Michigan, right? Like Illinois, for instance, has an emergency manager law now. A number of other states do. So I'm from Chicago, and over there, like the governor, in the governor's race, the Republican who's running, Bruce Rauner, all of his campaign ads are about Chicago's going to be the next. His very first campaign ad was all about the Detroit bankruptcy, and then in the last 10 seconds, he's like, and Illinois is next, Chicago's next, we need to do similar stuff here. The fact is that really there's a broader agenda here, which is both privatization and slashing pensions. And that's, broader national agenda, and this is like why, I mean, so why, Carol mentioned that there have been, most states do have, emergency manager laws that have been on the books for a long time, but this was sort of different about this recent round that is being pushed. It really is sort of big ideologically driven to be far more extreme than anything before it. And really, I think the reason why Detroit is so important is because everyone's sort of looking to Detroit to see what happens here, because they want to try to export this model to other places.
I think we all need to think about that very carefully, and we all need to think back about that quote from Reverend Niemauer, who said, first they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the Catholics. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Catholic, so on and so forth. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out.